The street is quieter than it should be. On Pennsylvania Avenue, where the traffic never truly stops, and the air carries the constant murmur of a capital at work, there is a building that does not announce itself loudly anymore. Its facade is clean, restored, respectable. Tourists pass it without slowing down, their eyes drawn instead to monuments and power. The White House stands only a short distance away, guarded and luminous. The city feels permanent here, fixed in history. But this building, this hotel, holds a silence that is harder to explain. At certain hours, just before dusk, when the light flattens against the stone and the flags hang without movement, the Willard seems to recede from the present. The doors open and close. Guests check in. Staff move efficiently through the lobby. Everything functions. And yet, something about it feels like a performance of continuity rather than the real thing itself. Because this is not just a hotel. This is what remains of something that was almost lost entirely. There was a time when this place was the center of American power in a way no government building could ever be. Deals were not just discussed here, they were decided. Wars were whispered into motion in its corridors. Presidents did not merely visit. They lived within its walls, shaping the country from its suites while the city outside strained to keep up. And then, for a long stretch of years, it became something else entirely. Forgotten, decaying, nearly erased. How does a place so central to a nation's identity come so close to disappearing? And more importantly, who allowed it to happen? That question lingers in the architecture itself. It is there in the polished floors that replaced worn carpets, in the reconstructed ceilings that now gleam where once plaster fell in quiet, unnoticed pieces. It is there in the absence of certain things, original fixtures, original textures, the small details that do not survive neglect. The Willard InterContinental, as it is known today, stands as both survivor and illusion. Its current form suggests continuity, but its history tells a different story, one of abandonment not by accident, but by choice. If you stand across the street long enough, you begin to notice how the building interacts with the city around it. The modern Washington, efficient, curated, controlled, moves past it without friction. But the Willard does not quite belong to this rhythm. It belongs to something older, something messier. Once, this stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue was not just a ceremonial route between institutions. It was alive with negotiation, ambition, and contradiction. The Willard sat at its center like a magnet for power. Politicians, lobbyists, generals, journalists, they all passed through its doors. Some came openly. Others preferred the quiet anonymity of a hotel lobby where conversations could dissolve into the background noise of movement and glassware. Inside, the building absorbed everything. And for decades, it gave something back. Influence. There is a story, repeated often, perhaps too neatly, that the term lobbyist itself was born here, in the Willard's lobby, where men waited to intercept President Ulysses S. Grant as he moved through the space. Whether or not the origin is precise, the image endures. A president, weary from the demands of office, moving through a hotel that had become indistinguishable from the machinery of governance itself. The Willard was not just adjacent to power. It was part of it. But power has a strange relationship with place. It gathers, it intensifies, and then, often without warning, it moves on. By the mid-20th century, Washington began to change. Not in its monuments. They remained fixed, but in its priorities. The city expanded outward. New buildings rose. New centers of influence formed, quieter, more insulated. The old patterns, the ones that had sustained places like the Willard, began to dissolve. And when they dissolved, they did not leave behind a vacuum. They left behind neglect. The hotel, once so central, became inconvenient. Too old, too expensive to maintain, too tied to a version of Washington that no longer aligned with the future being imagined by planners and developers. Its grandeur, once an asset, became a liability. And so, slowly, it was allowed to decline. Not all at once, not dramatically. There was no single moment when the doors were shut and the lights turned off. Instead, it happened in increments so small they were easy to ignore. A room left unrenovated, a corridor closed off, maintenance deferred, guests noticing, then choosing other places. The building did not collapse. It faded. A newspaper report from the 1960s described the interior in stark terms. Peeling paint, outdated furnishings, a sense of grandeur that had curdled into something closer to embarrassment. It was still standing, still operating, but no longer commanding respect. And in a city built on the careful preservation of image, that was enough to seal its fate. The land beneath the Willard was valuable, extremely valuable. Developers saw opportunity not in restoration, but in replacement. The logic was simple. Tear it down, build something new, something modern, something profitable. And for a time, it seemed inevitable that they would succeed. The building closed. The rooms emptied. The lobby, once filled with the low murmur of negotiation and ambition, fell silent. Dust gathered where conversations once shifted the course of policy. The landscape, the street, the avenue, the slow, indifferent movement of the city continued without pause. The Willard waited. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over abandoned places. It is not the absence of sound, but the absence of purpose. The walls remain. The structure holds. But the reason for its existence has been stripped away. For years, that silence defined the Willard. And yet, it was never fully gone. That is what makes its story unsettling. Not that it disappeared, but that it was allowed to reach the edge of disappearance in full view of a city that understood exactly what it was losing. Because this was not an unknown building. This was not a forgotten relic on the outskirts of history. This was a place woven directly into the narrative of the United States itself. Its decline was visible, documented, discussed, and still, for years, nothing stopped it. The question remains, pressing and unresolved. What does it say about a society when it nearly destroys the very places that once defined its identity? Not out of necessity, but out of convenience. The Willard still stands today, restored, reclaimed, its surfaces polished back into a version of what they once were. But the memory of its near erasure has not disappeared. It lingers in the building's quiet moments, in the subtle dissonance between what is presented and what was almost lost. The street continues to move. The city continues to function. The facade remains intact, but beneath it, the story is still there, waiting. Before the Willard ever stood on Pennsylvania Avenue, before its name carried the weight of presidents and power brokers, this stretch of land existed in a city that was still trying to decide what it wanted to be. Washington, in the early decades of the 19th century, was not yet the polished capital we recognize today. It was in many ways unfinished. The grand vision of Pierre L'Enfant, the wide avenues, the symbolic alignments, the sense of deliberate magnificence, existed more on paper than in reality. Roads turned to mud in the rain. Buildings stood isolated, separated by open lots and uncertainty. The government itself was still finding its rhythm, its authority fragile, its identity unsettled. And yet, even in that uncertainty, there was ambition. The location that would one day hold the Willard sat along a route that mattered. Not because of what it was, but because of what it connected. Pennsylvania Avenue linked the Capitol to the President's house. It was, by design, a corridor of power. But in those early years, it was also something more unpredictable. A place where politicians, merchants, soldiers, and travelers collided in a city that had not yet learned how to contain them. The first structure to rise on this site was not the Willard. It was a far more modest hotel, opened in the early 1800s, known as the City Hotel. Its purpose was practical: provide lodging, offer food, serve the constant flow of people moving through a capital that lacked the infrastructure to support them. There was no grand vision attached to it, no expectation that it would become anything more than a useful stop along a developing avenue. But even then, something about the location made it different. Hotels in Washington were never just hotels. They became extensions of political life. Congressmen who could not yet afford permanent residences stayed in them for months at a time. Negotiations spilled out of official chambers and into dining rooms. Alliances were formed not in structured meetings, but over shared meals and late-night conversations. The City Hotel absorbed this atmosphere quickly. It was not elegant, not especially refined, but it was positioned at the exact intersection of necessity and opportunity. And in a city still defining itself, that was enough. The transformation began when the property changed hands. Enter Henry Willard. He was not born into wealth or influence. He did not arrive in Washington as a figure of immediate importance, but he understood something fundamental about the city, something others overlooked. Washington was not just a place of governance. It was a place of performance. Power here was not only exercised, it was displayed, negotiated, and reinforced through proximity. And proximity required space. In the 1840s, Willard took control of the struggling hotel and began to reshape it, not simply as a business, but as an idea. He expanded it, renovated it, elevated its standards, but more importantly, he redefined its purpose. This would not be just a place to stay. It would be a place to be seen. The changes were not instantaneous, but they were deliberate. Rooms became more refined, dining spaces more structured, service more attentive. Willard understood that if he could attract the right people, the hotel would transform itself. And slowly it did. Washington in the mid-19th century was a city on the brink of something larger. Tensions between North and South were intensifying. Political discourse was becoming sharper, more urgent. The country was moving toward a conflict it did not yet fully comprehend. And in the middle of it all, the Willard, still evolving, still expanding, became a gathering point. Not because it was mandated, but because it worked. Travelers arriving in the capital found it reliable. Politicians found it convenient. Journalists found it indispensable. The hotel began to develop a reputation, not just for comfort, but for access. You could come here and encounter the people shaping the nation. You could sit in the same room, hear the same conversations, sense the direction of events before they became official. This was not accidental. Henry Willard cultivated it carefully. He understood that the true value of his hotel was not in its architecture, but in its atmosphere. It needed to feel alive, relevant, essential to the functioning of the city itself. And for a time it did. An account from the period, recorded in a letter by a visiting diplomat, described the experience of entering the hotel lobby, a constant movement of figures, voices overlapping, the sense that no single conversation could be isolated because all of them seemed to matter. It was, the writer noted, less a place of rest than a theater of affairs. That observation captures something critical. The Willard was not trying to be quiet. It was trying to be central. As the decades progressed, the building continued to grow. Additions were made. Interiors were upgraded. The hotel expanded both physically and symbolically, becoming one of the most prominent establishments in Washington. But with growth came a deeper entanglement with the forces shaping the country. Because the Willard was rising at the exact moment the United States was approaching its greatest internal fracture. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Washington became a city of tension. Political leaders arrived carrying not just agendas, but grievances. Debates grew sharper. Compromises became harder to sustain. The air itself seemed charged with something unresolved, and the Willard stood directly within that atmosphere. Figures moved through its halls who would soon find themselves on opposite sides of a national conflict. Conversations that began in its rooms would echo into battlefields. Decisions, informal at first, would harden into positions that could not be reversed. The hotel did not create these forces, but it contained them. There is a quiet moral complexity in that role. The Willard was a space of connection, but also of confrontation. It facilitated dialogue, but it also witnessed the breakdown of that dialogue. It provided comfort to men who would soon oversee extraordinary suffering, and it did so without judgment. Because a building does not choose its history, it only holds it. By the time the Civil War began, the Willard had already secured its place in the fabric of the nation. It was no longer just a successful hotel. It was an institution, one that reflected both the aspirations and the contradictions of the country it served. Its rise was not simply a story of business success. It was a story of alignment. Right place, right time, right understanding of what Washington was becoming. And yet, embedded within that success were the same vulnerabilities that would later bring it to the brink of disappearance. Because the very thing that made the Willard essential, its connection to power, also made it dependent on forces beyond its control. Power shifts, cities evolve, priorities change, and places that once seemed indispensable can, with unsettling speed, become expendable. At its origin, none of that was visible. Standing on Pennsylvania Avenue in those early years, Watching the hotel grow, expand, and fill with life, it would have been impossible to imagine a future in which it would be abandoned. Impossible to believe that something so central could ever be considered unnecessary. But history rarely announces its intentions in advance. It builds quietly, just as the Willard once did. By the time the Willard reached its height, it no longer needed to announce its importance. It was understood. Carriages arrived in steady succession along Pennsylvania Avenue, wheels grinding softly against the road as uniformed attendants moved with practiced precision. The doors opened. Figures stepped out, some recognizable, others deliberately anonymous, and disappeared into the interior, where the real business of the nation often began. Inside, the air was never still. The lobby moved like a living organism. Conversations overlapped in low, controlled tones. Boots crossed marble. Papers changed hands without ceremony. A man could arrive unknown and, within an hour, find himself drawn into a discussion that might shape legislation, policy, or something far less visible but equally consequential. The Willard did not demand attention. It absorbed it. At its peak in the mid to late 19th century, the hotel had become something beyond architecture. It was a system, a place where proximity created influence, where access could alter outcomes, and where the boundaries between official and unofficial power dissolved into something fluid. Presidents stayed here, not occasionally, but habitually, before the White House became the fully secured, insulated residence it is today. It was common for incoming leaders to take rooms at the Willard. Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington in 1861 under threat of assassination and spent his final days before inauguration within the hotel's walls. The city outside was tense, uncertain, on the edge of rupture. Inside, the Willard became a temporary seat of executive gravity. A contemporary newspaper account described the scene with restrained urgency. Mr. Lincoln receives callers from morning until late evening. The corridors crowded with those seeking audience, their purposes as varied as the crisis itself. The hotel was not simply housing a president-elect. It was containing a moment of national anxiety, and it did so with a kind of quiet efficiency that would define its reputation. The rooms themselves were designed to reflect status without ostentation. High ceilings, heavy drapery, furniture arranged not just for comfort, but for conversation. Everything encouraged interaction. Everything suggested that no meeting here was entirely private, and yet none would be publicly exposed. Downstairs, the dining rooms carried a different rhythm. Silverware against porcelain, the low hum of voices, waiters moving with unobtrusive precision. Deals unfolded between courses. Alliances were tested over coffee. The separation between social ritual and political maneuvering was almost non-existent. An observer writing for a Washington periodical in the 1870s noted, "One does not dine at the Willard without consequence. Even the most casual invitation carries with it the possibility of obligation." It was not a place for idle presence. To be there was to participate, whether intentionally or not. And then there was the lobby. Always the lobby. Wide, open, and perpetually in motion, it became the unofficial antechamber of American governance. Men waited there, sometimes patiently, sometimes not, hoping to intercept those with authority. Senators passed through. Cabinet members lingered just long enough to be approached. The president himself, Ulysses S. Grant, was known to walk through the space, pausing briefly before retreating from the persistent demands of those seeking influence. It is here that the enduring story of the lobbyist takes hold. Whether myth or partial truth, the image remains powerful. Individuals positioning themselves in the hotel's lobby, waiting for the opportunity to make their case directly to power. The term itself may have older roots, but its association with the Willard captures something essential. This was a place where access could be negotiated in real time, where democracy, in its most practical and sometimes uncomfortable form, unfolded not in chambers, but in hallways. The hotel thrived on this dynamic. It was not merely accommodating power, it was facilitating it. And as Washington grew, so did the Willard's influence. Diplomats from foreign governments took rooms there, recognizing the proximity to American officials mattered as much as formal meetings. Journalists lingered in its public spaces, gathering fragments of information that would later shape public understanding. Military officers, fresh from campaigns or preparing for them, moved through its corridors with a sense of urgency that never fully dissipated. The Willard became a crossroads, a place where stories began before they were written, a place where decisions were shaped before they were announced. There were nights when the building seemed incapable of rest. Gaslight flickered against polished surfaces as conversations stretched into early morning hours. The city outside quieted, but the hotel did not. It held too many intersecting ambitions to ever truly sleep. And yet, beneath this constant motion, there was a structure, a discipline that kept everything from collapsing into chaos. Henry Willard's vision and the systems he put in place ensured that the hotel maintained a balance between openness and control. Guests felt access, but never complete freedom. Staff observed without intruding. The building itself guided behavior, subtly reinforcing the idea that while anything might be discussed here, nothing should be mishandled. This balance was the key to its success, but it was also fragile, because what made the Willard powerful was not something it owned. It was something it borrowed. Influence, attention, relevance. These were not permanent assets. They flowed through the hotel because at that moment in history, the conditions of Washington demanded a space like it. But those conditions were never guaranteed to last. Even at its height, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible, that the world around the Willard was beginning to shift. Government structures were becoming more formalized. The machinery of power was slowly moving away from informal gathering spaces toward controlled environments. Offices expanded. Institutions hardened. The need for a central, shared social space began to diminish. At first, this change did not threaten the hotel. It was too established, too embedded in the habits of those who mattered. But the shift had begun, and once it begins, it does not reverse. Still, in these years, these golden years, the Willard remained at full strength. Its reputation was unmatched, its presence unavoidable. To understand Washington, one had to pass through its doors. The building stood firm, its facade facing Pennsylvania Avenue with quiet confidence. The street moved around it. Carriages came and went. The city continued its gradual transformation, and inside, the Willard held everything together. For a time, there's a tendency, when looking back at places like the Willard, to remember only what was visible. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the steady procession of powerful men moving through its corridors, as if history itself had taken up residence inside the building. It is an easy image to hold on to, clean, structured, reassuring in its sense of importance. But no place like this is ever as simple as it appears, because beneath the movement, beneath the influence, beneath the quiet choreography of power, there's always something else, something less visible, something that does not present itself openly, but exists all the same. The Willard was not just a witness to history. It was part of its machinery, and that machinery was not always honorable. The same proximity that made the hotel essential also made it a space where influence could be shaped in ways that never reached public record. Deals were not always transparent. Conversations were not always accountable. The blurred line between access and advantage became, over time, something more difficult to ignore. The lobby, so often described as the heart of democratic interaction, was also a place where that interaction could be quietly distorted. Men waited there not simply to present arguments, but to apply pressure, to secure outcomes that would benefit a few at the expense of many. The term lobbyist, whether born here or not, carries with it an implication that cannot be separated from the Willard's identity. It suggests persistence, but it also suggests imbalance. A letter preserved in the archives of a Washington newspaper from the late 19th century captures this tension with unusual clarity. The writer, a junior congressional aide whose name is recorded only in initials, described the lobby as a place where influence gathers without record, where decisions begin before they are ever debated, and where the appearance of openness conceals a deeper arrangement of power. That phrase, the appearance of openness, cuts through the polished image of the hotel. Because the Willard did not operate in secrecy, it operated in visibility. Everything happened in plain sight. Conversations unfolded in public spaces. Meetings were not hidden behind locked doors. And yet, the outcomes of those interactions often remained inaccessible to those not present. It was not corruption in the crude sense. It was something more refined, more difficult to define, and more difficult to challenge. The hotel's success depended on this balance. It had to remain open enough to attract those seeking access, but controlled enough to ensure that access did not dissolve into chaos. It had to project legitimacy while accommodating the informal networks that made Washington function. And for decades, it managed that balance with precision. But there were other layers, quieter ones, that rarely enter the official narrative. The Willard, like much of Washington in the 19th and early 20th centuries, existed within a society structured by exclusion. The grandeur of its public spaces did not extend equally to all. The people who moved freely through its lobby, who occupied its rooms, who shaped its atmosphere, these were not representative of the nation as a whole. They were a narrow segment, predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly positioned within systems of power that excluded others by design. The hotel did not create these boundaries, but it reinforced them. Its elegance, its reputation, its very identity were tied to a version of society that defined access as a privilege rather than a right. Those who served within its walls, staff, attendants, laborers, were essential to its operation, yet largely invisible within its story. Their presence was constant. Their recognition was not. An account from an early 20th century service worker, recorded decades later in an oral history project, offers a brief but revealing perspective. "You saw everything," the man recalled, "but you were not meant to be part of it. You moved through the same rooms, heard the same voices, but none of it belonged to you." That separation between those who shaped events and those who facilitated them was not unique to the Willard, but within its walls, it was particularly stark, because here, the performance of power was so visible, so concentrated, so carefully maintained. There is also the question of what was being decided in those rooms. Not every conversation led to progress. Not every agreement served the public good. Policies that would later be debated in Congress often began as informal understandings between individuals whose interests did not always align with those they represented. The Willard provided the space for those understandings to take shape, and in doing so, it became entangled in the consequences. This is the complexity that lingers beneath its history. It was a place of connection, but also of exclusion, a place of dialogue, but also of quiet influence, a place where the ideals of democracy were both practiced and, at times, undermined. And yet, none of this was hidden. That is what makes it difficult to confront. The building stood in full view of the nation's capital. Its role was known, its function understood. There were no secrets about what happened there, only a collective acceptance that this was how things worked. The landscape itself seemed to absorb this contradiction. Pennsylvania Avenue, stretching between the centers of legislative and executive power, carried with it a symbolic clarity. It represented the connection between institutions, the movement of governance, the visibility of democracy, and at its center, the Willard complicated that symbolism, because it revealed that what happened between those institutions, what happened in the spaces not formally designated for decision-making, could be just as significant, perhaps more so. For years, this complexity remained unchallenged. The hotel continued to operate, continued to host, continued to facilitate. Its reputation endured, even as the nature of power began to shift around it. But the very qualities that made it indispensable also made it vulnerable. Because a system built on informal influence cannot survive unchanged in a world that increasingly demands structure, transparency, and control. The Willard was a product of its time, and like all such places, it carried within it the seeds of its own instability, not in the form of a single flaw, but in the accumulation of contradictions. Contradictions that, for a long time, were ignored, until they could no longer be. It did not happen all at once. There was no single announcement, no dramatic closure that forced the city to confront what it was losing. The Willard did not fall in a moment of spectacle. It slipped, quietly at first, then faster than anyone expected. By the early 20th century, the conditions that had sustained the hotel for decades were beginning to fracture. Washington was no longer a city that depended on shared spaces in the same way. Government offices expanded. Private meeting rooms replaced public negotiation. Influence, once fluid and visible in places like the Willard's lobby, began to retreat behind closed doors. The change was subtle, but it was irreversible. At first, the hotel adapted. It renovated where it could, updated its services, attempted to preserve its reputation as the city's central gathering place. But something essential had shifted, and no amount of surface improvement could restore it. The Willard had been built on proximity. Now, proximity was no longer enough. New hotels emerged, modern, efficient, designed for a different kind of guest. They offered privacy, exclusivity, insulation from the unpredictable flow of public life. Where the Willard invited interaction, these new spaces controlled it. And power followed. Not immediately, not completely, but steadily. The figures who once lingered in the Willard's lobby began to appear less frequently. Conversations that once unfolded in its open spaces moved elsewhere, into offices, into institutions, into environments designed to limit access rather than invite it. The hotel remained, but its role diminished. A report from a Washington business journal in the 1920s captured the shift with quiet precision. The Willard continues to operate with distinction, though its position as the center of political society has been gradually assumed by newer establishments better suited to the evolving character of the capital. Gradually, the word suggests control, but what followed felt anything but controlled. Because decline, once it reaches a certain point, does not remain gradual. It accelerates. Maintenance costs rose. The building, already aging, required constant attention. Systems installed in an earlier era began to fail. Heating, plumbing, structural elements, all demanded investment that ownership hesitated to provide. Rooms that had once hosted presidents began to feel outdated. Furnishings wore down, carpets thinned, paint dulled. Guests noticed, and when guests notice, they choose. Occupancy declined, revenue tightened, decisions became reactive rather than strategic. There is a moment in the life of any institution when survival shifts from being assumed to being uncertain. For the Willard, that moment did not arrive with a single event. It emerged through accumulation, a series of choices, delays, and missed opportunities that, taken together, formed a trajectory. And once that trajectory pointed downward, it did not correct itself. Ownership changed hands. Each new owner brought plans, promises, visions of restoration or reinvention. But the scale of what was required continued to grow. What might have been manageable a decade earlier became overwhelming. The building was too large, too complex, too expensive to maintain without a clear return. And in a city where land value was rising rapidly, the calculation began to shift. Not how to save the Willard, but whether it was worth saving at all. By the mid-20th century, the question was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. Developers looked at the property and saw potential, not in preservation, but in replacement. The logic was efficient, almost clinical. Demolish the aging structure, clear the space, build something new, something aligned with the modern identity of Washington. The Willard, once indispensable, was now an obstacle. There were voices that resisted this framing. Historians, preservationists, individuals who understood what the building represented, not just architecturally, but culturally. They argued that the hotel was more than a piece of real estate. It was a repository of national memory, a place where the intangible elements of history, conversation, presence, decision had taken form. But these arguments faced a different kind of pressure. Economic, practical, immediate. A city does not preserve everything. It chooses. And in those years, the choices being made in Washington did not favor places like the Willard. An article from the 1950s quoted a city planner who spoke with a tone of measured inevitability. We must consider the future needs of the capital. Sentiment cannot dictate development. The statement was not aggressive. It did not dismiss the building outright, but it framed the conversation in a way that made preservation seem secondary, an option, not a priority. That framing mattered, because once preservation becomes optional, it becomes vulnerable. The hotel continued to operate, but the signs of decline were no longer subtle. Guests described rooms that felt neglected, public spaces that carried an echo of former grandeur, but little of its substance. The lobby, once the center of national life, grew quieter. Not empty, but diminished. There were still visitors, still activity, but the sense of inevitability The feeling that this was where things happened had disappeared. And without that, the Willard became something else. A relic. By the 1960s, the situation had reached a point of no return. The building required extensive renovation, far beyond what its current operations could support. The cost was significant, the return uncertain, and the surrounding city had moved on. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic. It was administrative. The hotel closed. Doors that had opened continuously for over a century were shut. Rooms that had held conversations shaping the nation fell silent. The lobby, once defined by movement, became still. No final gathering, no ceremony, just absence. And then, something even more unsettling. Nothing happened. The building remained standing, but unused. Plans for demolition circulated. Proposals were drafted. Debates occurred, but no immediate action followed. The Willard entered a state that is, in some ways, more haunting than destruction. It was left in between, not alive, not gone. The windows darkened. Dust settled. Time, which had once moved quickly within its walls, slowed to something almost imperceptible. The city continued to evolve around it, traffic passing, decisions being made elsewhere. The landscape did not pause. It never does. But the Willard had reached its turning point. Not with a collapse, not with a fire, but with a decision. To stop. The building did not resist. It stood where it had always stood, facing Pennsylvania Avenue, its facade unchanged, its structure intact. From the outside, there was no immediate sign that anything had ended. The same walls, the same windows, the same quiet authority in its presence. But inside, everything had stopped. The doors were closed. The lights were off. The movement that had once defined the Willard, the constant flow of voices, footsteps, decisions, was gone. In its place, there was a stillness that did not belong to a place built for activity. Dust settled slowly, almost carefully, across surfaces that had once been in constant use. Rooms that had held presidents sat in darkness. Hallways that had carried the weight of urgent conversation became corridors of silence. The lobby, once the center of a nation's informal power, stood empty, its scale now emphasizing absence rather than importance. There is a difference between a building that has been destroyed and one that has been abandoned. Destruction is immediate, final. It leaves no ambiguity. Abandonment lingers, and the Willard lingered. For years, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the hotel existed in a suspended state, too significant to ignore, too inconvenient to restore, too valuable to be dismissed entirely. Proposals circulated. Developers revisited the idea of demolition. Preservationists argued for intervention. Committees formed, dissolved, reformed. Nothing resolved. In the meantime, the building continued to deteriorate. Water found its way through aging systems, seeping into walls, weakening structures that had once felt immovable. Plaster cracked, wood warped, fixtures corroded. Each small failure compounded the next, accelerating a process that, once begun, is difficult to halt without decisive action. And decisive action did not come. An inspection report from the early 1970s described the interior in stark, clinical terms. Significant structural degradation observed. Extensive restoration required. Immediate intervention recommended to prevent irreversible loss. The language was precise, unemotional, but the implication was clear. Time was running out. Outside, the city continued forward. Washington in these decades was not static. It was redefining itself. New federal buildings rose with clean lines and modern materials. Urban planning initiatives reshaped entire districts. The priorities of the capital were shifting toward efficiency, security, and expansion. The Willard did not fit easily into that vision. It belonged to an earlier version of the city, one built on proximity and informal exchange. A version that no longer aligned with the systems now taking hold. And so, as the city advanced, the hotel remained behind, its relevance diminishing with each passing year. But it was not entirely forgotten. There were those who remembered what it had been, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Former employees, longtime residents, individuals who had passed through its rooms when it still held meaning. Their accounts, recorded in fragments, carry a different kind of weight. A former concierge, interviewed decades later, described returning to the building during its abandoned years. "You could still feel it," he said. "Even with everything gone, you could tell what it used to be. The space hadn't forgotten." That observation is difficult to quantify, but it matters, because places like the Willard do not lose their identity immediately. It erodes, gradually, unevenly. Some rooms hold on to it longer than others. Some details persist, even as the larger structure fails. And yet, erosion continues. By the mid-1970s, the possibility of demolition was no longer distant. It was active. Plans were developed that would have erased the building entirely, replacing it with something new, something aligned with the economic and architectural priorities of the time. The argument was familiar. The structure was outdated. The cost of restoration too high. The potential return too low. It was, in the language of development, inefficient. And inefficiency, in a city increasingly defined by calculation, is rarely tolerated. The machinery of removal began to take shape. Not physically, not yet, but procedurally. Approvals, assessments, negotiations. The slow, deliberate process that precedes disappearance. For the Willard, this was the closest it came to ending. Not in fire or collapse, but in paperwork. There is something unsettling about that kind of near-destruction. It lacks drama. It offers no moment of collective recognition, no point at which the loss becomes undeniable. Instead, it unfolds quietly within systems that operate without emotion. A decision made, a signature placed, a building erased, and then, unexpectedly, resistance solidified, not from a single figure, but from a convergence of voices, preservationists, historians, civic leaders, who recognized that what was at stake was not just a structure, but a continuity of memory. They argued, with increasing urgency, that the Willard was not replaceable, that its value could not be measured solely in financial terms, that once it was gone, it would not return. The debate intensified. Public attention, which had largely drifted elsewhere, began to refocus. Articles appeared. Statements were issued. The narrative shifted from inevitability to uncertainty. Could it be saved? And if so, at what cost? The building itself remained unchanged during this period, still silent, still deteriorating, still waiting. It had no voice in the argument unfolding around it, no ability to influence the outcome of its own existence. It simply endured. The landscape, as always, continued to observe. Pennsylvania Avenue carried on with its steady rhythm. Cars passed. People moved. Decisions were made in buildings that had replaced the functions the Willard once served. The city did not pause to consider what might be lost. Cities rarely do. And yet, the Willard had not yet crossed the final threshold. It stood at the edge, not preserved, not destroyed, held in a narrow space between what it had been and what it might never become again. The building stands. That is the first thing you notice when you return to it now. Not as it was, but as it exists today. The Willard is no longer abandoned. It is no longer silent in the way it once was. Its doors are open again. Light fills the lobby. Guests move through its corridors with the same quiet purpose that defined it more than a century ago. On the surface, it appears as though nothing was lost. But that is not true, because what stands here now is not simply the continuation of what once existed. It is a reconstruction, a decision made after years of hesitation, after the building had already crossed into decline, after its identity had been nearly erased. The Willard that exists today is the result of intervention, careful, deliberate, and undeniably costly. A restoration that sought not just to repair the structure, but to recover a version of its past. And yet, recovery is never complete. You can rebuild walls. You can restore ceilings. You can recreate the visual language of a place with remarkable precision. But the intangible elements, the accumulation of presence, the continuity of lived experience, do not return so easily. They leave traces, but they do not fully come back. The restoration of the Willard in the late 20th century was, in many ways, an act of recognition, an acknowledgement that something valuable had been allowed to slip too far, and that the cost of losing it entirely would be greater than the cost of saving it. Developers, investors, and preservationists aligned. Briefly, and perhaps reluctantly, around a shared understanding. This building mattered, not just economically, but historically, culturally, symbolically. The process was extensive. The damage accumulated over decades of neglect had to be undone piece by piece. Structural systems reinforced, interiors reconstructed, details researched, and, where possible, replicated. It was not a simple renovation. It was an attempt to bridge a gap in time, to reconnect the present with a past that had nearly been severed. When the hotel reopened, it did so with a renewed identity. The Willard InterContinental Washington, a name that acknowledged both its legacy and its integration into a modern system of global hospitality. It was, once again, operational. Once again, part of the city's active life. But something had changed, not in the architecture, in the context. The Washington that surrounds the Willard today is not the Washington that created it. Power no longer flows through hotel lobbies in the same way. Influence has become more structured, more insulated, more carefully managed. The informal spaces that once defined political life have been replaced by controlled environments, secured networks, private channels. The Willard still hosts, still welcomes, still functions, but it no longer holds the same kind of gravity. It is no longer the place where history gathers before it becomes official. It is a place where history is remembered, and there is a difference. If you stand in the lobby now, you can sense it. Not immediately, but gradually. The scale remains. The design suggests continuity. The movement of people creates the impression of importance. But the underlying current, the sense that something essential is happening just out of view, has softened. What remains is an echo, a carefully preserved echo. The landscape has not changed in its indifference. Pennsylvania Avenue still stretches between the centers of power, carrying the same symbolic weight it always has. The White House remains nearby, its presence constant. The city continues to operate with efficiency, its systems more complex, more controlled than those of the past. And the Willard stands within that landscape, restored but altered, present but no longer central. This is not failure, but it is not continuity either. It is something in between, a survival that required interruption, a legacy that required reconstruction. And that distinction matters, because it forces a question that extends beyond this building, beyond this street, beyond this city. Why was it allowed to reach the point where restoration became necessary at all? The Willard was not lost to natural disaster, not destroyed by war, not erased by forces beyond human control. Its decline was the result of decisions, incremental, rational, and, at the time, defensible. Maintenance deferred, investment delayed, priorities shifted. No single decision ended it, but together they nearly did. This is the pattern that repeats, not just here, but everywhere. We inherit places that carry meaning. We use them, depend on them, build our identities around them, and then, gradually, we begin to treat them as expendable, not because we no longer value them, but because we assume they will endure without our attention. The Willard did not endure on its own. It required intervention at the edge of disappearance. And even then, what returned was not exactly what had been lost. There is a quiet honesty in that outcome, a reminder that preservation is not the default state of history. It is a choice, one that must be made before absence becomes irreversible. The building stands now, restored, functional, admired. Visitors pass through its doors, often unaware of how close it came to vanishing entirely. The surfaces reflect care. The structure holds firm. The narrative, at a glance, appears intact. But beneath that surface, the story remains. Not just of what the Willard was, but of what almost happened to it, and what that reveals. Because the real question is not whether we can restore places like this once they're nearly gone. It is whether we recognize their value before they reach that point, or whether we wait, again, until silence fills the rooms, until the doors close, until the decision becomes urgent rather than optional. The Willard survived, but survival, in this case, came at the cost of interruption, and that cost is not always visible. So when you stand there now, watching the building as it exists in the present, complete, operational, seemingly secure, you are not just looking at a hotel. You are looking at a decision that was almost made too late. And the question that remains, long after the restoration is complete, is not about the Willard itself. It is about us. When the next place reaches this same edge, quietly, gradually, without spectacle, will we recognize what is happening in time to stop it? Or will we only understand its value when it is already gone?